It's a real privilege and not a little daunting to be invited onto this stage to talk farming with so many people who have lived on the land all their lives. I would like to thank all of you, many of them in this room, who have welcomed me onto their land over the last year and patiently educated me in the history, economics, and culture of our farms and farming communities. The National Food Strategy is due to publish an interim report in the spring and a final strategy in the winter. Our scope is intentionally broad. You might think insanely broad, and in the dark hours just before dawn, I sometimes think about that too. We've been asked to set out what needs to be done across all departments of government and in society more broadly to build a robust food system that provides good, affordable food to everyone, restores the environment, maintains our countryside, brings good jobs to our communities, rural and urban, and stops making us sick. In short, a system that will be proud to leave our children. The brief has to be big and complicated because the system itself is. It is a beautiful, hugely complex, interconnected web, or maybe even a web of interconnected webs. It has been impossible not to be awestruck by the way this logistical tapestry brings sustenance and pleasure to so many people, bestowing on us a variety of reasonably priced food that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. It shapes our beautiful landscapes, it feeds our cities, it is the backbone of our rural communities, and at the same time, it provides 1 in 7 of the people in this country with jobs. For those who don't work in the system, this is often taken for granted, but as we all know, it doesn't happen by accident. It is down to the ingenuity and hard work of millions of people. And yet, despite all this, we are increasingly aware that the system is doing harm as well as good. I asked a farming friend last week what she wanted to hear from me today. She told me that everyone understands the problems in the food system. With so many people in government already working on them, she said, where does the National Food Strategy fit in? To be brutally honest, what powers do you have and what levers will you use? I will come on to that, but the more I've thought about it, the less I am sure that there is any consensus, either on the scale of the problems or what is required to create a better system. To reach a consensus, we have to look at how we got where we are today. This is a story of determination and ingenuity. It is a story of heroism, particularly, I'm glad to say, standing on this stage, the heroism of farmers. It is also a story of unintended consequences, and one that many of you will know, but most of our fellow citizens do not. It is a story that can be told with 3 lines on a chart, and I think it is worth retelling today. In 1945, as the Second World War ground to a close, humanity faced an even greater existential threat. Despite all the bloodshed, the global population had more than doubled over the last 150 years, from 1 billion to 2.5 billion souls. And thanks to huge advances in medicine and hygiene, scientists were predicting an even bigger surge to come. Within the next 100 years, they said, there would be 9 billion people on the planet. How on earth were we to feed them all? In the past, the answer would have been simple. Dig up more land to produce more food. As Manette said earlier, it's what our farmers did during the Second World War. Before the war, we produced just 30% of our own food. By 1945, that number had risen to over 40%. For centuries, there has been an automatic correlation between global population growth, land in cultivation, and food production. This chart shows them growing together from the start of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century. You can see that globally, even the British agricultural revolution does not have much impact. The 3 lines rise at an almost identical rate. At the end of the war, scientists predicted huge population growth. There simply wouldn't be enough land to cultivate. Mass starvation seemed inevitable. But the neo-Malthusians had not reckoned on Norman Borlaug. The botanist had grown up in a small farm in Iowa during the Great Depression. He had seen starving people begging on the streets and rioting over food. It set him on a mission to fight hunger. Borlaug moved to Mexico in 1944, hoping to develop more productive strains of wheat. He spent his days in the heat-blasted fields, painstakingly crossbreeding wheat plants. He tweezed off stamen, placed tiny hoods over hundreds of thousands of individual heads of wheat, snipped florets and mingled pollens by hand. Completely absorbed in his work, he often slept on the dirt floor of his research hut. And his efforts, as we know, paid off. When Borlaug arrived in Mexico, the country's wheat yields were so low that it imported 60% of the wheat it consumed. By 1956, thanks to his high-yielding, short-stemmed, rust-resistant wheat, Mexico was self-sufficient. This success was repeated in India and Pakistan, and then across the world. As expected, global population soared. In 1950, the average life expectancy globally was 46. Today, globally, it is 73. Infant mortality has plummeted from 1 in 5 in 1950 to 1 in 20 today. There are more humans alive on Earth than ever before, and yet the threat of mass starvation has receded. The only famines recorded this century have been in countries riven by war or governed by totalitarian regimes. For the first time in agricultural history, the increase in food production and in calories harvested per person has massively outstripped the additional land being farmed. This is what became known as the Green Revolution. By adopting Borlaug's methods, farmers saved billions of people from starvation. It is poor distribution now, not underproduction of food, that causes hunger. But as so often happens, the solution to one problem creates others. As the amount of food available per person increased and companies found increasingly innovative ways to process, package, and market this surplus, so we got heavier. This shouldn't surprise us. Humans evolved in a world where food was scarce. We evolved to seek out calorie-rich foods. We evolved a palate that finds them almost irresistible, and when they are within arm's reach, we eat more of them. Borlaug's Green Revolution also made these calorie-dense food, refined wheat, sugar, vegetable oils, abundant and cheaper, which exacerbated the problem. It shouldn't surprise us that in the UK, you can now buy 28 different kinds of Kit Kat. They are an easier sell than runner beans, and therefore a more interesting commercial proposition. 18 of the largest food and drink companies rely on portfolios of food and drink, of which 85% are so unhealthy as to be regarded unsuitable for marketing to children under World Health Organization guidelines. This isn't a corporate conspiracy dreamed up by some evil genius bent on making us all ill and killing our children. It's economics. I hope that Roger Whiteside on the panel will give us an insight into the challenges this combination of genetics and economics poses to a company trying to do the right thing by its customers. In retrospect, we could have foreseen this problem. It has been coming towards us for 70 years, like a tidal wave far offshore that has only recently made landfall as sufficiently large numbers of us are overweight enough to cause serious health problems and a strain on our National Health Service. This is shown in this next slide, and my wife says she finds it complicated, so for the quick learners about you, I'm sorry if I go too slowly. You can see on this two charts. On the left side, a bell curve representing the distribution of BMI in the population. The solid line represents a BMI of 30, defined today as obese. The dotted vertical line represents a BMI of 40, defined today as severely obese. We start in 1950, the date at the top right-hand corner. You can see on the left that the average BMI then was about 20, defined now as a borderline between being ideal weight and a little underweight. Evenly distributed either side of that. Some people are underweight, some are overweight. And on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see the number of obese adults in the population with time running as the x-axis from 1950 to the present day. In 1950, you can see from the short bar, very few people were obese. Let's roll the clock forward. Over time, as food supply increases, you can see the bell curve moves gradually and steadily to the right as the population gets heavier. In the 80s, as that happens, the right-hand tail of the bell curve crosses the solid line, and enough of us start becoming obese for that to begin to register on the right-hand side of the chart. It's like that wave coming towards the shore. Let's roll the clock forward again to the current day. You can see that the right-hand side starts to steepen sharply. This so-called epidemic isn't a recent problem. It's a continuation of a long-term side effect of the Green Revolution, as the increasingly thick part of the bell curve crosses the solid line. If you look carefully, you can see another thing happening. The bell curve stretches to the right, creating a long tongue. It seems that some people, those in that tongue, react much more severely to this new food environment than others. And so more people are now severely obese than if we had the curve as a perfect bell. This is a structural problem, and it's likely to get worse. And it isn't just our health that suffered. As the amount of food being produced from a given area of land increased, so the amount of other life occupying that same land decreased. This chart shows wheat yields doubling from 1970 to today as the number of farmland birds decreases by 54%. This is just one example, and the problem isn't restricted to farmland. Of the 665 species surveyed in the 2019 State of Nature report, 27%, almost a third, had declined in the past 50 years, and 1,188 were threatened with extinction. Britain sits in the last place on the European Farmland Bird Index. We lost 44 million birds between 1966 and 2008. We lost 99% of our wildflower meadows, half our ancient woodland, 3/4 of our heathland, and 3/4 of our ponds. And finally, we also now know something that Borlaug could not possibly have known when he started his experiments. Every stage of the farming process exacerbates the carbon crisis. The forests cleared to plant crops, the energy-intensive manufacture of fertilizer, the release of carbon from degrading soils, the methane produced by rice paddies and livestock, the energy used by manufacturing plants and retail outlets, and the fuel used to power the vehicles in the supply chain. In total, very broadly, the supply chain globally is estimated to be between 20 and 30% of total global greenhouse gas emissions. In the UK, it's less. They're estimated the production emissions to be under 20%. But if you add what we consume in imported food, that rises again. So there is a simple story. We focused on an existential risk, growing enough food so we didn't starve. And we largely solved that problem. But as we increased the amount of food available to eat, we ate more and we got heavier. And as we got heavier, we got sick. And as we increased the amount of food we grew on our land, we drove out nature and increased our carbon emissions. The reason that I see this as a story of hope is that it shows that if we know what we want of the system, we can make it deliver. If we can align behind a common vision, as for our children's sake we surely must, we can pivot this system that has been so good at delivering sustenance, pleasure, jobs, and for some, profit, to one that does that while simultaneously restoring and enhancing our environment, sequestering carbon, and that stops making us sick. But as well as creating common purpose, as Evan said, there's a lot of detail to be worked through about what actions are required. I believe, for example, that we need to start framing the carbon problem as one of both production and consumption. The production-only climate change targets make no sense. What is the point of doing the enormous amount of work required to create a net zero farming economy here if we then just import the carbon from other countries? The same goes for animal welfare, biodiversity, and environmental pollution. We cannot only consider the externalities of what we produce here, but must apply the same standards to food imports. It would be wrong to create a gold standard for farming in this country and then incentivize those harms overseas in the form of lower standard food imports. It is a red line that as a society we must defend vigorously. It is a problem, incidentally, not just for us, but for the global trading community. There are enormous legal and regulatory hurdles to overcome, and Ian Mitchell, I hope, will be talking about some of those on the panel in a moment. We also need to have a more nuanced discussion about the cost of food. The argument is abysmally framed. On the one side, you have people who say that our food is too cheap, that the price we pay at the supermarket checkout does not represent the true cost to society as a whole. In some cases, you might point out, it doesn't even cover the farmers' costs. On the other side, people argue that increasing the cost of food would make it even harder for the least affluent to put food on the table. These are two separate issues, and they must not be conflated. We need to work out what the true cost of food is and separately understand why some people struggle to afford sufficient food. I'm not saying that food prices should or will rise, only that environmental degradation or widespread ill health is not a viable long-term solution to the problem of poverty. But there may be ways the food system can change to help those in poverty eat better, and I hope that Denise Bentley on the panel will shed some light on how those with scarce resources experience the system today and how it can improve to benefit them. We also need to understand why financial returns are distributed so unevenly across the supply chain. This chart shows the return on capital employed of businesses in different parts of the food sector, from agricultural input suppliers on the left to restaurants and fast food takeaways on the far right. You will not be surprised to see that farming, the blue line, is by far the lowest returning activity. And actually, that blue line is the subsidies. So without the subsidies, it's barely breaking even. The questions we need to answer is, how much is that caused by oligopolistic power in the market? How much by competition from global markets? How much by our high land prices and relatively high labor rates? And what do we need to do about it to create a genuinely sustainable farming sector? And daunting though the prospect is, we will need to take a position on meat. The tone of the debate in this area has been unpleasant. The name-calling and the framing of the argument in terms of goodies and baddies. But worse than the insults, it has become a dialogue of the deaf, with each side making their points increasingly trenchantly and no one listening, which might be all right if we weren't discussing the fate of our children. We will need to set out clearly the benefits and the costs of different production systems, from feedlots on land cleared of rainforest to cattle reared on permanent pasture or in regenerative agroecological rotations, and the impact of soy fed to poultry and pork. How does the animal welfare compare in each system? How much carbon does each produce? And how much pollution? We also need to understand the role that ruminants play in our diet, in improving soils, and more broadly in the farm ecosystem. I can only imagine the exasperation British livestock farmers must feel as they battle with a hugely competitive market and everything the British weather can throw at them, at the total lack of nuance in the debate. We hope to bring a little more light and a little less heat. Finally, we will need to think about the kinds of diversity we want in the food system as a whole. In his wonderful book, Linked, the physicist Albert Laszlo Barabasi describes the characteristics of complex networks, any complex network, the internet, human cells, or the food web. He describes the different ways that hubs and the spokes can be arranged within these systems and shows that small changes in topography can radically change their characteristics. Barabasi argues that we need to start thinking about nature's networks in a different way. Until now, scientists have tried to understand nature by disassembling it, breaking matter down into elements and then further into electrons spinning around protons and neutrons, which themselves are disassembled again into quarks, for example. Or thinking of nutrition only in terms of vitamins and minerals, proteins and fats, carbohydrates and fiber. We've spent trillions of research dollars on this project, like a child taking apart his favorite toy, he writes, and we have no idea how to put it together again. We are as close to knowing everything there is to know about the pieces, but we are as far as we have ever been from understanding nature as a whole. Riding reductionism, we run into the hard wall of complexity. Nature is not a well-designed puzzle with only one way to put it back together. Personally, as someone with an undergraduate degree in physics, and maybe therefore a reductionist by training, I'm fascinated by the implications of this. In some ways, it's the opposite of Borlaug's philosophy. He talked about reducing agriculture to a three-component system: good genes, nitrogen, and irrigation. Barabasi would argue that we need to think not just about biodiversity, but the diversity we want in the food system itself, of seeds in seed banks, of crops planted in fields, of foods in our diet, of types of agricultural system, of ports and infrastructure, of local versus global production. This question about diversity, I believe, will be at the heart of many of the solutions. And yet every farmer I've met, from the largest commercial farm to the smallest smallholding, instinctively gets this. I haven't met anyone who is not deeply invested in finding out more about their soil and about the biodiversity on their farmland, and understanding how they use this knowledge to create a more sustainable system. Emblematic of this, I think, is the gradual coming together of the Oxford Farming Conference and the Oxford Real Farming Conference, as people walk between the two, creating the kind of links Barabasi describes in his networks. To tackle today's problems, we need to combine the best of old wisdom and new science. We need to work together. I hope that John Shropshire on the panel can talk about how he is attempting to make a transition from a narrow definition of productivity to farm in a way that also maximizes nutritional density, minimizes inputs and carbon emissions, and increases biodiversity. Transforming the food system is a huge undertaking, and it is not something that the government can do alone. In spring, as I mentioned before, we'll publish our interim report, which will set out a rigorous analysis of the system today, the power structures and economics that shape it, alongside a vision of the kind of food system we might aspire to. We will then need to look at what needs to happen to get us from here to there, what is required from government, business, civil society, and citizens to get us from A to B, what is working well already here and abroad, and what can government do differently to oil the wheels of change. Some of these questions must be answered not by scientists or economists, but by the people of this country. What do we want our countryside to look like? When it comes to health, what role do we want the government to play in helping us eat a better diet? Immediately after the interim report, we will be launching in-depth dialogues in every region of the country, within government and with citizens, businesses, civil society, and youth. These will culminate in a citizens' assembly towards the end of the year, where a randomly selected, demographically representative group will debate the evidence and agree recommendations. You can find more detail about all of this on our website. We will incorporate the Citizens' Assembly recommendations into the final strategy. The government has agreed to respond with a white paper after 6 months and has asked me to come back to review their progress 12 months after that. All this may sound daunting. Change is coming. We cannot afford to leave our children a food system that makes them and the planet sick. The government cannot make that change alone. It will require dispersed leadership from across the system, from all of us. But this is also a time of enormous opportunity. In a low-carbon world, we will require much more from our land. We will need it not only to provide food, but materials and renewable energy. But we'll need it to sequester carbon. Rather than being only the victim of floods, farmers will be paid to help mitigate against them and to provide different habitats for nature. These additional demands will inevitably provide opportunities for farmers, the traditional stewards of the land who know its frailties and capabilities better than any of us. And if Britain can lead the world in this effort, we will also be able to benefit by exporting that knowledge abroad. If you want to be involved in our dialogues or to become an ambassador for change, if you think you're doing something well and differently that we should see, or you simply want to harangue us, please send us your details and thoughts at nationalfoodstrategy.org. When we faced the last crisis in our food system, our heroes were the farmers who led the way. I believe and trust you will do so again. Thank you.